Greetings. I'm pleased to be with you today to introduce our final speaker in this year's Empire Lecture Series, Gary Michael Segura of Stanford University. In graduate school, I took a class on game theory, and I was pulling my hair out trying to solve the proofs and trying to understand things, and I saw there was a professor sitting in on this class for fun, Gary Segura, and I thought, wow, who does that? And he seemed to understand everything, and I didn't understand it at the time. But then I came to realize that's a model scholar, someone engaged on the theoretical and methodological forefronts of the discipline and who practices a very engaged and also problem-driven scholarship. So I've continued to learn from Professor Segura ever since. Dr. Segura's work focuses on issues of political representation and social cleavages, the domestic politics of wartime public opinion, and the politics of America's growing Latino minority. Among his most recent publications are Latino America, How America's Most Dynamic Population is Poised to Transform the Politics of the Nation with Matt Barreto, The Future is Ours, Minority Politics, Political Behavior, and the Multiracial Era of American Politics with Sean Bowler, and two books with the Latino National Survey team, and another in the works with Cambridge University Press on public opinion and war. So today, using some high-profile examples, he'll argue for a discipline more intimately engaged in problem-driven research in his talk, In Case You Missed It, Political Science, Academia, and the Challenge of Relevance in a Changing America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Segura to the stage.
Wow, thank you for the introduction. And I'm really happy to be here, and I was happy to be asked to give this talk. This is going to be a little bit of a shift of topic for me, so I hope everyone kind of bears with me. So the talk's entitled, In Case You Missed It. And it's entitled that because we as a discipline have committed a number of notable failures in the last several decades, perhaps most famously the failure to anticipate the fall of the Eastern Bloc. I think we're on the cusp of this again. And so think of this lecture as a cautionary screed. The execution of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland and Alex Nieto and on and on and on has raised awareness of police brutality and the unequal treatment of non-whites by authorities throughout the criminal justice system. The emergence of Donald Trump and the reemergence of working-class white anger has put to rest foolish notions of a post-racial America that we heard a lot after the 2008 election, and unleashed and seemingly licensed as acceptable anti-Latino bias and, in some instances, physical brutality. State legislatures, supported by right-wing clearinghouses of ideological policy, defund public schools and higher education, restrict voting rights, overregulate abortion access to the point of denying those rights to their citizens, and eviscerate environmental protections, worker rights, and even open meeting laws. And what these cases have in common is that, with very few exceptions, political science has almost nothing to say to any of them. Consider for a moment criminal justice, then the events in Ferguson, and the explosion of protests that occurred after those events came to pass. It is curious to me that after the United States Postal Service, the police represent the most frequent interaction between citizens and their government in our society, but it attracts essentially no attention from political science. Political science has for a generation or more paid little attention to policing, to the nature of those interactions, and to their effects. This interaction between government and citizen often involves what we call the legitimate, or in more recent instances I think of as the legitimized use of force, but we inexplicably leave this to the sociologists. Beyond just simply the question of criminal justice, the subfield of public law has been so de-emphasized as to be wholly absent from several of the most prominent departments in the discipline, including my own. I frequently comment to faculty colleagues who are wondering what we should be searching for, that there's an entire co-equal branch of American government unrepresented in our faculty of 46. similarly de-emphasized are state and local government, public policy, urban politics, and so on. Now, this is not to say that there's no work, and indeed some very good work, emerging in political science on some of these issues. Vesla Weaver and Amy Lerman's excellent book, Arresting Citizenship, addresses some of the important implications for democracy when so many citizens focused in specific social identity groups find themselves under the watchful gaze of the state. In another example, a student of mine who presented here yesterday, Jonathan Mumolo, presented fascinating findings regarding the stop and frisk policy in New York City, a policy so championed by the right. In Jonathan's data, he shows that in one recent fiscal year before the termination of the policy, the number of reported and recorded stops and frisks of African American males between the ages of 18 and 39 exceeded the number of African American males the Census Bureau believes New York City has between the ages of 18 and 39, meaning that in expectation, every person was stopped more than once. For the most part, however, it's been scholars of color outside of political science, including lawyers Michelle Alexander and Brian Stevenson, sociologist Bruce Western at Harvard, my colleague Jennifer Eberhard, a social psychologist and a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, who have done the real work on this. For some groups in our society, Bentham's panopticon is real. This, in my opinion, is a crisis. Just as it did when it failed so spectacularly to foresee the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Eastern Bloc, political science, in my opinion, is facing a crisis because the discipline is structurally ill-suited to identifying and researching the most pressing problems of our time. Now, I think this crisis is the product of three distinct challenges, one recurring and two long-standing. And as you'll see, I think two of the challenges are what produces the third. The first challenge is methodological fetishism. I'll talk more about each of them in just a moment. The second is breathtaking demographic homogeneity. And the third, the consequence of those two, is the disconnect from important social and political problems. Now, importantly, these are not distinct, but in fact interact, and my principal claim in the talk today is that the challenge to political science engaging social problems is linked to these methodological and demographic realities. Let me talk for a second about methodological fetishism. And I use the word fetishism on purpose. There's a recurring pattern in the discipline of political science where new or renewed methods, usually borrowed from another social science, all too often economics, but not exclusively, remake the standards of proof considered defensible, and as a consequence, rewrite graduate curricula. The current emphases on experimentation and causal inference are just the latest in a long line of past moments. I joked to a colleague of mine the other night that I survived the great Lisrel scare of 1990. I was told in all earnestness that unless I mastered Lisrel and indeed a broad variety of structural equation modeling techniques, that my career would founder. I didn't, and it didn't, so there. These trends are exacerbated through nodal programs of training which can influence and, in fact, have already substantially reshaped the methods landscape of the entire field in a very short period of time. And part of that is because, of course, other departments of political science are frequently staffed with the graduates of these nodal units, and even those that aren't attempt to emulate the methodological fashions of the moment. Now, there are intellectual consequences to these fetishisms. So first, I want to make the point that we should not confuse a change in design or method norms with intellectual advancement. They may be. And in fact, I think a good example of where a change in methodological norms represented a genuine intellectual advance was the development in the late 1990s of post-estimation procedures for maximum likelihood estimation, some of which was developed at Harvard with Gary King, and some of which was developed in Indiana with Scott Long, but which made the use of various MLE techniques much more discernible and understandable to the reading, consuming intellectual public. But some of this is methodological bro behavior. That is, it's a function of fashion, not an intellectual advance. My favorite example of this, for which I know there will be pushback, is the use of the statistical programming language R. Now, I am a graduate of a political science generation where we wrote all of our programs to do our statistical analysis, much like young people are doing today, in R. And when Stata came along and allowed us to simply enter a command and see the result, many of us danced, well, not naked, but scantily clad in our various quads, celebrating being freed from the programming requirements of SAS or SPSS batch mode. It is no doubt the case that some scientists, particularly methodologists, are better using R than they are prepackaged programs. No question. It is a different question whether the vast majority of quantitative political scientists using these packages to produce the results they need, but not themselves investigating new methodological frontiers, need to be engaged in the months-long training that is necessary in order to master this very difficult and complicated programming language. Both fashion on the one hand and genuine innovation on the other then create an arms race in the range and volume of, quote, required, unquote, training in graduate programs. This increases the number of courses that are required of all students, and it also increases the number of students who feel compelled, either rhetorically or perhaps even in practice by advisors, to declare methods as a second field. At Stanford, and I'll say up front in honesty that Stanford's undergoing a graduate curricular reform, which I support and I'm really excited about, but it is the case now at Stanford that if methods is one of your two principal fields, you can receive a PhD in political science having taken only really 4 10-week seminars in politics. The overemphasis on design can become an end unto itself, the preference for the clever over the insightful. My colleague and friend Dara Strolovich at Princeton describes this as the freakonomicization of political science. It is more important to be clever and to have a neat design than to actually have discovered something of importance. Now, the insistence on a particular methodological approach can result in a drunkard search in terms of the problem selection that we engage in as we choose what we're going to research. Everyone's familiar with the notion of the drunkard search. That's the idea of a drunk who loses his keys in the alley, but searches for them under the street light because the light is better there. Take, for example, the subject of immigration. Now, one of my colleagues is a noted expert on immigration and has developed a series of papers, carefully researched, and which I find very persuasive, regarding how the Swiss population engages in the question of immigrant incorporation into their society. And at first glance, Switzerland is a good laboratory for the study of immigration. Nearly a quarter of all Swiss residents are foreign-born. Now that number is about 1.9 million people. For comparison, about 3.6 million immigrants live in Los Angeles County. About 3.2 million immigrants live in the 5 boroughs of New York. In the United States, there are 42.1 million immigrants, 80% of whom hail from either Latin America or Asia. By consequence, in the 1.9 million immigrants in Switzerland, 85% of them are other white Europeans. So when you're going to study the process of social incorporation, in a world in which the mass movements of populations include millions of Asians and Latin Americans moving to North America, and millions of residents of the Maghreb, the Levant, and Sub-Saharan Africa moving to Europe, studying immigration in Switzerland isn't wrong, but it is sort of beside the point. Now, there are adverse effects that come to the discipline as a consequence of these intellectual consequences of methodological fetishism. To the extent that methodologists impose their design judgments on job candidates in other fields of the discipline, those candidates actually become incentivized to ask and answer smaller questions, to acquire even more training, or to risk failing to land a job. Big think questions. The idea that someone would develop a big idea, flesh it out, and in the course of their dissertation only have the opportunity to do some exploratory analysis, may likely find them eviscerated at the hands of a methodologist who has judged them to have committed a form of apostasy and disqualifying them for appointment. Interestingly enough, methodologists themselves may well be advantaged in the employment and promotion system. The hiring of toolbox scholars is a very common undertaking in political science departments these days, and those toolbox scholars, by and large, are very productive. But in part, they are productive because they bring their methodological skill set to new and different substantive problems, frequently by partnering with scholars who are substantive experts on the field. The irony, of course, is that at the end of this process, you could have a toolbox scholar with a lengthy publication record who knows comparatively little about any specific element of politics. With those things in mind, methodological fetishism, in my opinion, is best understood as cartel behavior, creating barriers to market entry that preserve the privileged position of the methodologist at the expense of the substantive expertise. So I want to say something for a moment, lest you think I am a leftover or holdover from the perestroika insurrection of the early 2000s. For those of you who know my scholarship, I'm a large-N empirical social scientist, and I believe in it. During most of the methods wars, I was a happy warrior for large-N analysis. I found inferential claims based on small n to be inherently suspect, and concluded quite comfortably that a single case study can prove two and only two things, non-necessity and non-sufficiency, but that beyond that, we needed degrees of freedom in order to be able to map social processes where one or more causes produce a variety of effects. I'm fearful that we've entered a new phase of methodological orthodoxy where the practitioners of large-N data analysis know less rather than more than they used to. Now, we have recently witnessed the American Statistical Association expressly refute what has been the conventional use of the most familiar metric in all of statistics, the p-value. And we should be left wondering if perhaps maybe we aren't all being a little bit fooled. While a p-value of p less than or equal to 0.05 is widely understood by even the youngest of school children in social science methodology classes as being a finding, did a p-value of 0.06 or 0.11 ever really mean that the hypothesized effect is indistinguishable from zero? Are we really willing to reject hypotheses that don't occur, null hypotheses that could not have occurred by chance more than 94% of the time, as opposed to 95? Now, in fairness, scholars as important and sharp as Larry Bartels have long ago advocated for the abandonment of these arbitrary constraints. Larry, some of you may know, is a big believer in, producing the coefficient, producing the standard error, and let the reader be the judge. But alas, that's not how assistant professors get published in referee journals, and they know that. I would also recommend to you Deidre McCloskey's really interesting and, by the way, beautifully entitled book, The Vices of Economists, The Virtues of the Bourgeoisie, where she makes a persuasive argument on the importance of substantive rather than statistical significance. The problem, of course, is that the determination of social and substantive significance requires a theoretical matrix within which to situate your findings, something that's hard to do with 4 substantive classes on politics. Now I'm going to switch for a second to the question of demography. The American Political Science Association's Task Force on Political Science in the 21st Century examined the composition of the discipline's workforce. These numbers date back to 2010, which the last complete year of data they had when they wrote the report. In 2010, there were 8,273 white political science faculty members, 75% of whom were male. There were 461 African Americans, or 5%, 249 Latinos, 2.7%, and 319 Asian Pacific Islanders, or 3.4%. They were all less male, but still approximately 2/3 male. So in total, at that time, the discipline was 88.9% white and 71.4% male. And since I served on the APSA Council and the Committee on the Status of Latinos a decade earlier, in the late 90s, I can tell you that those numbers have, in the last decade and a half, not moved at all. Do not lull yourself to sleep on the theory of monotonic improvement. That is not what is occurring. In the United States, of course, at the same time, women were a thin majority of all persons, and whites were 63% of the population. What happens when we have a homogeneous profession? Earlier, I pointed to a series of phenomena that attracted only scant attention from political scientists. The selection of research questions needs to be understood as a reflection of the interest of the scholar in question, which are often linked to life experience. The homogeneity of political science on gender and racial terms, and class for that matter, has at least 3 intellectual consequences I want to draw your attention to. Some questions aren't asked, or at least not with the frequency that they should be asked given their importance in society. Some questions are held in lower esteem in our discipline. But most importantly, even some of the questions that are asked and answered invariably result in wrong, or at best, partial answers, often with the scholars involved, and almost certainly with the scholars who receive those wisdom through citations, more or less completely unaware of the oversight. Some of you may recall earlier this year, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas was caught in an election day scam in Iowa using a mailer to try to convince people that they would be socially embarrassed if they did not turn out to caucus. As some of you probably already know, that is actually an outgrowth of a very well-known field experiment by Gerber, Green, and Larimer in 2008, which is widely cited and is part of the larger revolution in field experimentation that Alan and Don helped shepherd in. Now, I want to be clear, this is not a criticism of the article, but in how people come to understand it. So reading from page 36 of the article, quote, prior to random assignment, we also removed households with the following characteristics. All members of the household had over a 60% probability of voting by absentee ballot, or all household members had a greater than 60% probability of choosing the Democratic primary rather than the Republican primary. Now, Alan and Don were excluding Democratic primary voters because in that particular election year, the Democratic primary was uncontested and should have produced a catastrophically low turnout number. Then there's a footnote. Those with a high probability of choosing the Democratic primary were determined by living in a Democratic precinct, being African American, being Hispanic, being a single female, being born between 1930 and 1959, voting in a primary election where most of the turnout was Democratic, and so forth. So, this most famous finding on the role of social norms and social pressure on get-out-to-vote effectiveness is really a result that applies only to white Republicans living in Republican-dominated environments, excluding most single women. That is the extent to which these findings could and should be generalized. Those results on social monitoring may not function the same among communities of color or single women. Let's imagine that we send a letter to Latino populations where there's a large number of non-citizens, telling them that we're watching what they're doing. Or in African American communities, are we sure the result will be the same? Of course, these findings also assume a host of other social correlates by virtue of the low-density communities that are in the sample frame. Suburban neighborhoods where people know one another, rather than dense urban environments where your neighbors might be anonymous and you don't really care if they know whether or not you voted. So the finding isn't wrong, but the willingness of 501c3 groups in Washington and beyond, and subsequent scholars, to generalize beyond the study's frame could well be very, very wrong, with unintended or even negative consequences. And the point I want to make with this is that cultural competency matters to research. For example, does Catholicism predict a Democrat or Republican vote? In the NES, it predicts a Republican vote, but if you confine your analysis to Latinos, it predicts a Democratic vote. Does Catholicism predict opposition to marriage equality? Do people think voting is admirable? Are voting and other forms of participation positively or negatively correlated? The answers are often deeply dependent on who the question is about. Class and race shape our perspective in ways sometimes that even the authors do not fully understand. A prominent political scientist recently opined in the New York Times that we could alleviate two social ills simultaneously if we gave Detroit to the Syrians. This is a quote from the article. In 2013, the city, which has a higher proportion of black residents than any large city in America, elected its first white mayor in more than 40 years. The city showed remarkable resilience and unity in emerging from municipal bankruptcy with a reorganization plan that, among other things, preserved the collection of the Detroit Institute of Arts. So first, the obvious. Detroit did not belong to them. It belongs to someone else. The idea that we could keep a settled refugee population in Detroit by offering them favorable home loans and small business loans might be an idea that the current residents of Detroit might find neat too. But less obviously, should the preservation of a municipal art collection be considered the sign of a right-thinking municipal leadership structure when significant shares of the population of that city are losing access to the city's water supply because of unpaid bills? That is, do right-thinking cities emerge from bankruptcy with everyone having drinking water, or with the art collection preserved? Second, why is the election of a white mayor assumed on its own to be a signal of goodness or improvement? A third example. Our disciplinary economist envy has significantly shaped more than a few major departments, my own included. The political economy faith in fundamentals, coupled with several attitudinal dimensions, dominates election forecasting within this line of thought. A second line of thought in election forecasting looks at institutional factors and electoral history, kind of the cycle approach. Both approaches show almost no interest in the issues of social identity and political action, which scholars of minority politics study in depth. This myopia leads to almost ruinous moments like this. This is a headline from February 26th in US News and World Report. Trump will become president, says extremely accurate statistician. One of our colleagues, who may in fact be at the conference, who I know only in passing, Helmut Norpoth, produced a model which he suggests has a 97% chance of seeing Trump elected over Hillary Clinton unless Bernie's nominated, in which case the chance of a Trump victory is 99%. Does anyone in this room believe that? Whatever your private politics, any awareness of identity group political practices and recent events in American politics would clearly call that last forecast into question. By contrast, in the summer of 2015, Latino Decisions released an analysis on the composition of the electorate in 2016 and projecting best and worst case scenarios for the GOP. Now, I want you to recall for a minute the election of 2012. In the election of 2012, the unemployment rate was 7.2%, the Democratic nominee was an African American, and the Republican nominee got 59.2% of the white vote. And yet he still lost by 5 million votes. So when we looked at the 2016 election, we made conservative assumptions regarding the change of the composition of the electorate from 2012 to 2016. We made conservative assumptions on the Democratic vote share in each of the major racial and ethnic groups. And then we estimated what it would take, either among white voters or among Latino voters, in order for the GOP to win a popular vote margin. Hint, it's not going to happen. And there's a URL, go to Latino Decisions and look up 2016 calculator and go play with the numbers. In short, if Latinos give only 40% of their votes to Republicans, Republicans need a white share of the electorate on the level that Ronald Reagan won in 1984. Which leads me finally and ultimately to problem-driven research. How then are demography and methodological fetishism shaping our ability to do problem-driven research? The homogeneity of the profession loses the focus that would be provided by scholars from underrepresented backgrounds. My brightest undergraduates at Stanford have no interest in graduate political science training at all, preferring instead to study public policy, education, or law. Methodological fetishism reinforces this exclusion through the cartel behavior raising barriers to admission. Further, the focus of design over substance causes us to select questions based on an empirical tractability rather than their importance, and focuses training on technique, while de-emphasizing the very substance that attracted the politically engaged to studying politics in the first place. Some of you may have had the experience I did. I came to political science because I was interested in politics. So my closing thoughts. Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach reads, "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Problem-focused research is not anti-scientific. We select our questions based on our normative beliefs. There's no question about that. But once the question is selected, the rigors of the scientific method can be applied and the resulting answers be scientifically defensible. Think, for example, of medical research. In the contest between cancer and people, we are all unambiguously on the side of people, but it doesn't bias the research outcomes. Carefully crafted, causally identified models of angels dancing on the heads of pins benefits no one but the author, and will continue to put off women and students of color whose interest in engaging the social world rather than slicing off smaller and less relevant slivers for relentless and valueless examination. And with that, I'll open it to questions. Stunned silence.
Thanks for that presentation. I'm wondering if you could comment on the divide between public policy schools and political science programs. I've sensed a bit of animosity there. Do you think that's part of the problem? And if so, is there something we could do about it?
Mm-hmm. The division of public policy from political science varies in its structure at different institutions around the country. And so there's no, I can't really give you a generalizable answer. I went to a doctoral program where the public policy program was in the political science program. More and more, I think we see them as distinct. I think that there is a genuine disregard or denigration of quote-unquote applied research in most of the traditional social science disciplines. So that, particularly political science, so that if you're interested in sort of, let's say, addressing a problem of urban governance, you really need to be over in the policy school because we're not really interested in that, and we tell our students that. And I think that that's not only not in our interest, but it's not in their interest either. I mean, I think we actually do have something to say. I'm not condemnatory towards the discipline as an undertaking. Indeed, it's been my life's work. And I think if we have something to say, we have the opportunity to bring those ideas to actual social ills. Again, though, the distinction, it varies a lot from campus to campus. In some places, they're dotted lines. In some cases, they're very hard divisions.
So I wonder if you could comment on perhaps what I would think about as another potential issue in political science, which is not just methodological fetishism, but theoretical fetishism, to the point that it would poo-poo description, as if we know too much about the world already and merely uncovering or measuring facts about the world are unnecessary.
I'm not sure I understand the context of your question. Are you suggesting that every project must have some form of theoretical advance and that an empirical advance is not sufficient?
So to take your example of, for example, immigrants in Los Angeles,
Mm-hmm.
suppose that we were able to do an in-depth study that let us know a lot about the sort of lived experience about these folks, not only their political views, but their economic state of the world, the places they live. And from this, we could go about perhaps generating theories, but we may, because we engaged in this incredible effort in order to carefully measure and describe this population, not then also contribute a theory.
Okay, so you're probably, I mean, I spent most of my life doing data development, and so not surprisingly, I'm likely to agree with you that sometimes simple collection of information and measurement is a huge contribution in and of itself. Theory, I mean, it depends on where you are on or what you believe about the process of theory development, moving back and forth between induction and deduction. But at some point, it has to begin with at least a simple observation of the world. And observations of certain parts of the world or certain aspects of social reality are harder in some instances than others. And so, no, I wouldn't denigrate in any way people whose primary contributions are empirical. We do have a tradition, as I think you're pointing out, of suggesting that someone who hasn't made a theoretical contribution, that the article is less valuable, it shouldn't be published in a major journal, the book is less important, etc. And for reasons of disciplinary culture, I think it's going to be a long time before it's someone, well, let me amend that. I was going to say it's going to be a long time before empirical contributions and theoretical contributions were treated equally, but I think there are exceptions to that, and the exception, I think, is the methodological whiz-bangery that I was talking about before, where the ability to do something on a particular question is more important than actually advancing our state of understanding on it.
Gary, great talk. So what's the solution, right? I mean, I agree with everything that you're saying, and I think that there are some trends that suggest that change is afoot. So on the one hand, I think that you're absolutely right about the way that we hone in on problems to fit methods, but I've also seen a trend, particularly with things like the monkey cage, the desire to have more public engagement. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly, problem-driven research, but the desire to sort of, highlight what we're doing and how that may matter for politics. I think that's been a move sort of in the direction that you're advocating, but what will it really take to promote change? Like, what institutions need to change? Your cancer example is really poignant because, if you read the New York Times, they're saying we can't make breakthroughs in cancer research because everyone wants to fund the things that aren't really working and they're not giving, out-of-the-box ideas a cut. So what do we have to do to improve?
If I had a magic wand and if I had to identify the things I would focus on first, the first would be to rebalance graduate training such that interest in substantive problems is given due course. That 8 courses in methodology and 4 courses in substance does not a PhD make. So that would be the first change I would make. The second is that the discipline needs to rethink how it goes about bringing women and people of color to suggest we have programs, I've participated in them, many of you have contributed to them, they're not working. Latinos are 2.7% of the discipline and a whopping 3.3% of graduate students. It's not changing. The number of women being under 30% was true in the late 1990s, it's true today. So I think we need to look at ourselves with a more critical eye. I've participated in conversations in my current institution and previous employers where people look at one another and absolutely haven't a clue as to why a woman might not find the current environment wondrous. And it's an environment that's 80% white men. And so we get these sorts of clueless normalizations. The idea that what is just what is. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. We have to do extra things to bring other people. But what we're doing is all good and all wondrous, and it's not. So I think that changing the culture is a big important step. Anyone who's ever looked at poli-sci rumors knows that there are deep cultural problems in this discipline, and I know that that is not a random sample of the population of this discipline, but neither is it an extreme outlier.
Hi, Gary. Great talk. Found myself agreeing with much more of it than I thought, so how disappointing. But I have sort of a comment and a question. The comment is, I think you're certainly right about what you've termed methodological fetishism, and I really appreciate it coming from you because it's the way you've put it. It's clearly not an anti-quantitative political science. It's anti, we keep changing or raising the bar of sophistication such that people can't do findings on real politics and it's closed off. I think one way of potentially, I think what we as a discipline need to do more work on as well is often the gap between sort of the construction of these new methods and the ease with which they're able to be applied is huge, okay? Because I often find the huge barrier with a new method is not that it exists or I can't comprehend what it's trying to do, but using it because of the cartelization you talk about, it's made hard versus, you know, is a method better necessarily because I can, or worse, because I can type the code in Stata and it's very simple to do. And I think my answer, like yours, I think would be no. And so that we need, part of the answer, I think, to your question would be to make some of this sort of, is both to maybe fight the cartelization, but also to make it so that there's less of a gap. The question is, and this is sort of another elephant in the room, is related to your important question about how do we get more African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and women into the discipline is, how do we get people into the discipline? I feel like, no, seriously, that political science is increasingly a downwardly mobile profession, okay? And particularly unless you're attending one of the very top graduate programs, your chances of getting jobs that provide more money than, or enough money to like live a good middle-class lifestyle seems to be declining. And so how do we, I mean, to me that seems, doesn't explain the issues you talked about, because simply natural attrition you would think would have led to more women, if nothing else, but why, I mean, to me, I think that's an increasing problem, and is it related to potentially that our whole model of university will hopefully at least make it for you and me to retirement, but how much further beyond that, I don't know.
Okay, for those of you who missed the last comment, David just referred to me as old, which is true. I think you raise a valid point. I'm not quite sure I'd make you the ambassador for recruitment for the APSA anytime soon. And I don't think of us as necessarily downwardly mobile, but your observation is correct that a PhD from any institution ranked below 30 or 35 has a very difficult time getting a tenure track job. A PhD from an institution between 35 and 20 could also actually be difficult. And we know of folks who even have prestige PhDs and for one reason or another don't match when they're on the market. I think that there are a variety of answers to that, some of which are probably more systemic than you're going to want me to go. I think the wholesale underfunding of higher education at the state level, something that we haven't done a good job studying, by the way, has meant that the ratio of tenure track professors to freeway faculty and adjuncts has gotten more and more adverse over time, such that at large teaching institutions like many of the Cal State campuses, well over 50% of the instruction is delivered by part-time faculty members who cannot make a living. Even though they have advanced degrees, they cannot make a living doing the sort of work that they're required to do. This is especially true at the community college level, where the vast majority of instructors don't have PhDs. I've often thought that if the American public simply understood that there were qualified professionals who could and should be teaching their children both at the state colleges and at the community colleges and demanded change, that we could improve the employment prospects of people with PhDs in the social science fields considerably. With respect to the recruitment of women, I will say that family-friendly policies continue to be an exceedingly difficult challenge, even at well-established institutions, including well-established institutions with which I'm deeply familiar. The presumption, the continued unfair presumption that women provide a majority of the child care in parenting relationships is a social reality. And most, unpleasant though it is, and most political science departments and many universities are very poor at accommodating themselves to that issue. So I think it is still very difficult to be a mom and to be a working professional in political science. And I think it's probably more difficult in some fields than it is in others. I know of a political scientist who left the discipline because rather than an attempt to accommodate her child care schedule, her department appeared to be punishing her for it. I don't think that's an isolated incident.
Okay, last question.
So, Judy Colberg at Eastern Michigan University. First, I'd like to say that I'm so glad I came to listen to you today because I've been thinking all these things as I've been sitting through the panels for the last 2 days. And I think all of these trends have been present in the discipline. I saw a lot of this when I was in grad school in the 80s, but it's deeper now. It's worse. All of these trends are now sort of like taking over the intellectual life of political science. And I'm a discussant on one panel, and all 4 papers are about the historical development of institutions, but the analysis is completely stripped of the context. So these are young scholars, they're very intelligent, but they don't know anything about the historical cases that they're writing about. So to me, this kind of raises bigger questions about interdisciplinarity and sort of political science in its relationship with other disciplines. Mm-hmm. So in addition to the kind of changes that you're talking about in graduate curriculum, I think a lot of PhD programs have removed the language requirement. Isn't that correct? We still had it at Michigan when I was in grad school. And then we had a cognate, so we had to take 2 courses in another discipline. So I did history. And then that just kind of more generally, if I think of at my university, the people who are teaching really interesting classes on politics are in the humanities. So they're philosophers, they're historians, they're the English professors. And increasingly, our students who want to study critical theory or intersectionality, racism, issues of immigration, they don't come to our department because none of us are teaching those things. They go to English and they go to some of the other humanities. So noting this, and I'm on the board of the Michigan Political Science Association. We're going to meet again next. We have a small conference every year, and we last year when we met. And it's almost all, white guys and me on this board. And the older gentlemen, who are all great guys, they said, this is a problem. We're not very diverse. And what do we do about that? And I said, well, how about if we open it up to other disciplines, our conference, so that it's about politics and not political science? Because if we had a conference that was about politics, we'd get people from other disciplines coming. And I think that would be a good thing for us. And I believe that that's so. I'm going to try to argue for it again this year. They didn't go for it last year. But what about that as an idea for political science, to do more kind of interdisciplinary collaborations and conferences? I think it could infuse the discipline with the kind of big questions that you're asking about, kind of appreciation of the understanding of history and culture, et cetera, that perhaps we've lost in our graduate education.
Sure. I mean, that's a lot. Let me respond to different parts of it. In terms of breadth, in terms of the idea that there would be, course requirements outside of political science and doctoral programs, again, courses in politics and doctoral programs are in short supply is my first concern, but I share yours, the idea that you would reach beyond the boundaries of the discipline. We talk a good turn about interdisciplinarity in the American academic establishment, but we're not really super in favor of it. Let me give you a case in point. My own university, Stanford University, is by most measures an important educational institution. There is no interdisciplinary program at Stanford which hires people and grants tenure. All interdisciplinary programs at Stanford are staffed by faculty who are hired through the traditional disciplines. So in race, for example, we don't hire the best people in race in the Center for Race and Ethnicity. We hire the best people that the departments aggressively not interested in race will allow us to hire. It's a miracle any of the programs exist. So there's a certain, that sort of problem I think is actually pretty widespread. There are 2 APSA presidents in the room. They might have thoughts on this, but I know that the APSA has engaged in efforts in the past to reach out to facilitate cross-membership in like the American Historical Association, American Sociological Association, etc. I don't know of efforts to stage any sort of joint conference proceedings or events, but I think that that's not necessarily a bad idea. And your experience of people on campus teaching politics that's way more attractive. Last year, Stanford University had a large, hugely attended course on mass incarceration. and it was taught by the Institute for the Diversity in the Arts, not by political science or sociology, for that matter. Yeah, so any other questions?
Please join me in thanking Gary Segura for this very stimulating talk.